Hey everyone! The topic of my presentation is Timothy Morton's Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World. I'll start with a brief introduction to the term itself and different philosophies embodied by Morton throughout the text. I'll go into the different properties that he defines and conclude by discussing the time of hyperobjects and what he means when he says after the end of the world. The term hyperobjects was originally coined by Morton in his previous book, Ecology Without Nature, which I highly recommend. But he uses this book to dive a little deeper into what hyperobjects are and what it means to be living with and within them. The prefix hyper implies high, beyond, or excessive in regard to something else. So hyper attached to object defines objects that are beyond our normal or conventional conception of objects, things beyond our comprehension of what a thing can be. Some examples from the text include a black hole, the Florida Everglades, nature, evolution. Morton favors global warming as a prime example of a hyperobject, which he threads throughout the entire text. Presented here are three different definitions of hyperobject. The first from Morton himself. The others are interpretations by different reviewers of the work. I like the middle definition here by Bennett, 2013, who says, hyperobjects are mind-blowing entities because their ahuman timescales and extremely large occupation of space unravel the very notion of entity. So throughout the book, entity or object or thing are all used interchangeably to define a thing that we cannot understand. Morton favors object-oriented ontology throughout the book, or OOO, which is an emerging philosophy. The term was coined by Graham Harman, and it is greatly influenced by the metaphysics of Heidegger, which focus on non-anthropocentric thinking. It actually deliberately opposes Kant's philosophies, which Morton mentions often, and opposes the post-Kantian attention to human relationships with objects. So the metaphysics of object-oriented ontology sees objects' relationships with objects rather than subjects or humans and their relationships with objects. So utilizing these philosophies, Morton presents these 5 different properties to further define what hyperobjects are and how they interact. The first he introduces is the property of viscosity. He says hyperobjects stick to beings that are involved with them. He uses the famous mirror scene from The Matrix as an example of the stickiness of hyperobjects. So Neo touches the mirror, and once he touches it, the mirror just seems to encompass his body. Once we know and learn about hyperobjects, they stick to our consciousness and ooze into our daily reality. For example, it's hard to talk about the weather without global warming kind of looming over or seeping into the topic. The next property Morton introduces is non-locality. Any local manifestation of a hyperobject is not the hyperobject itself. The term non-locality comes from quantum theory and quantum physics, which Morton says is the only existing theory that firmly establishes that things really do exist beyond our mind or beyond what any mind can comprehend. So while quantum theory focuses on extremely small scales, Morton blows this theory up and says such gigantic scales are involved that hyperobjects cannot be thought of as occupying any now point in time or space. So in a sense, they are everywhere and anywhere at any given moment, and any local manifestation that you see or that you experience is not the hyperobject itself. So for example, when you are in a rainstorm and you feel raindrops on your head, you are experiencing the climate of the area where you are located, but the raindrops themselves are not the hyperobject climate. The next property is temporal undulation, which is just a fancy way to say that hyperobjects involve profoundly different temporalities or timescales than the ones that we're used to as humans. Hyperobjects are time stretched to such a vast extent that they become almost impossible to hold in mind. Morton says, "We really have no time to fully learn about hyperobjects because their scale is so vast, but nonetheless, they exist and we have to handle them anyway." A good quote I found to exemplify this temporal undulation of hyperobjects. "Hyperobjects are thus like our experience of a pool while swimming. Everywhere we are submersed within the pool, yet we are nonetheless independent of the water. We produce effects in the water like diffraction patterns, and we cause it to ripple in particular ways." This leads into the next property, which is phasing. Morton says hyperobjects occupy a high-dimensional phase space that results in their being invisible to humans for stretches of time. He often uses this esoteric language of phase space, but what he really means to say is that we can only see slivers or pieces of hyperobjects at a time. The dimensions that they occupy are much greater than those that we occupy, so their time scales see us as a blip, while the other way around, we can't even comprehend the full extent of them. He includes this cute comic in the text called "Two Rocks Converse," which just touches on the vastly different time scale that these rocks have compared to humans, and uses this as a metaphor for how hyperobjects and humans would relate. And finally, the last property is interobjectivity. Studies in the style of American philosopher Ken Wilber have coined the term interobjectivity to refer to systems of related objects instead of systems of related subjects. So of course this ties in perfectly with Morton's favorite ontology. He says hyperobjects provide great examples of interobjectivity, namely the way in which nothing is ever experienced directly, but only as mediated through other entities. So he uses the example of a fossilized dinosaur footprint. He says the dinosaur footprint in the fossilized mud is not the dinosaur, it is not evolution, but the footprint is a trace of the hyperobject evolution that joins you, the dinosaur, and the mud together in that moment of experience. So Morton moves into the second part of the book, which is to find the time of hyperobjects. He says, the world has already ended and we are now in this age of asymmetry in which hyperobjects exist and we cannot deny or ignore them. So what does it mean when he says the end of the world? He says, hyperobjects are what have brought about the end of the world. Clearly, planet Earth has not exploded, but the concept world is no longer operational. World is not just an idea in your head, it's the way the fields roll toward a horizon, on top of which a red setting sun augurs peace and contentment. He goes on, but essentially, he just aims to unveil these concepts of world, nature, environment from under this idealization that we create. He says that by creating distance between ourselves and our perspective, and this false idea of the world we want to save, we will actually gain a greater intimacy and a greater practicality about the problems that we face, and also the necessary urgency with which to address them. Bennett says that she believes their target is human hubris. So the pride of humanity and the hubris that kind of encompasses our anthropocentric perspective is actually preventing us from seeing hyperobjects as fully as we can and understanding what it means for us now and for our future. He calls the age that we're living in now the age of asymmetry. By asymmetry, he basically means the more we know, the less we understand. So the more we know about radiation, global warming, these massive objects that show up on our radar, the more enmeshed in them we realize we are. Hyperobjects in this sense render both denialism and apocalyptic environmentalism obsolete. Any response to hyperobjects is quote-unquote wrong because we have no way to know what is right. Using the example of global warming again, because by definition, as a hyperobject, global warming can never be understood nor pointed to or defined succinctly, one can easily fall into denialism where if there's no proof, it doesn't exist. On the other side of the coin, because global warming is so overbearing, so vastly distributed in time and in space, one can easily fall into an apocalyptic mindset of hopelessness, and the fear takes over that there's nothing we can do. He says knowledge is not enough to address hyperobjects. We're living now in a time of hypocrisy where every decision is wrong. The strongly held belief that the world is about to end unless we act now is paradoxically one of the most powerful factors that inhibits a full engagement with our ecological coexistence here on Earth. He says, we are no longer on the edge of the cliff. We're no longer looking down off the precipice at the end of the world, at the problems that could occur. He says we're already in full free fall and poses the question to the reader open-endedly at the end of the book, what do we do now? What do we do now that we understand that there are these types of objects that we cannot understand? How do we grapple with the philosophy of non-anthropocentric thinking, and how can we utilize that in the stepping away from our perspective and our pride and our hubris? How do we utilize that to address the problems that we face? So that is the conclusion of the presentation and what I have to say about hyperobjects. Here I've just included the questions that I've come up with for discussion and the references that I've utilized. So the first question is, how is object-oriented ontology different from anthropocentrism? I touch on this in the presentation, but I also go into a little more depth within my paper. The second question, Morton uses dinosaur footprints as an example of the way hyperobjects are mediated through other objects. What are some other examples of objects through which we experience hyperobjects? I'm interested to see what examples you guys can come up with for the ways that we experience, for example, global warming, climate, gravity, etc. And the last question, regarding the non-anthropocentric way in which hyperobjects exist, Morton says, should we feel terrified or liberated? Both. How could a disconnection from this human-centered view be both terrifying and liberating? Thank you guys so much for tuning into the presentation, and I look forward to the discussion boards this week.